are truly blessed today to have His grace and the Suriel with us today on campus. Especially, I'm not sure if you guys know this piece of information, but if we could say who is the founder of Coptic Society, we would say His Grace and the Suriel. He's the one who kind of founded the idea of Coptic Society and had a great vision, and we're so thankful for him, and not just here in Newark. And, look at all the campuses in mainly New Jersey, New York area. Um, all thanks to God, of course, and to His grace and the Suriel who's with us today. We're so thankful of his vision. Maybe 25 years ago, Sayyidina, it was around that time that it was around the same time as Abuna Morcos was ordained in 99, where the idea of Coptic society started. So we're very, very thankful, and we live and we see the benefits of the fruit of Coptic society, all the events and all the blessings and retreats and liturgies, all of that. We thank God and we thank His grace and the Suriel who's with us because His vision 25 years ago. Of course, you all know His grace and the Suriel. He received his PhD from Fordham University, and correct me if I say anything wrong, say that. He did his studies on Saint Habib Girgis, who we'll hear about today. And already we have churches after this great modern day saint. But because also his great work of His grace about Saint Habib Girgis, we got to know more and more. And His grace wrote a book about Saint Habib Girgis. So we're truly happy and blessed to have Sayyidina with us. On a personal level, His grace holds a great place in my heart personally, as we got to take His blessing when He was here serving with His grace many years ago. Continue serving with His grace, and His grace teaches full time in the Anba seminary here in New Jersey. So anyone who has a chance to take any courses will be a great blessing. Thank you, Sayyidina, for being with us.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. It's a great blessing and joy to be here with you at the University of NJIT. And thank you, Father Thomas, for your introduction and for your support and love. I've known Father Thomas since 1997, even before his ordination, and his many jokes and funny things that he used to do in conventions, I still remember. But we built a very strong relationship over many years, and also we pray for Abuna Morcos that God may give him good health and that he can return back to this very important meeting. And thank you to all of you for being here this afternoon. I know it must be almost exam time and finishing up semester soon, so I wish all of you every success in all of your studies and in your research, and I hope that all your results are all positive. God bless you all. So as Abuna mentioned, that I will speak a little bit today about Saint Archdeacon Habib Girgis, a little bit about his life, about the struggles he went through, about the legacy that he left for the church, and what we as young people can learn from the example that he provides for us. So usually I like to start to ask first, what do you know about Saint Archdeacon Habib Girgis? And if you've been in my the 3 seminary course, then obviously you know a lot, so give others perhaps a chance to say what they know. Anything? Yes.
I'm not sure if this is right, but I believe he first made like 400 servants.
He
designated like 400 servants.
There was many. There was hundreds. I don't know the exact number, but he was responsible for graduation of hundreds, yes, of young men that became priests, ordained and became priests, Sunday school teachers, youth leaders, and many roles in the church, yes?
I was going to say, didn't he incorporate Sunday school to the Coptic church?
Yeah, so he was the one really that, after a few decrees from the Pope at the time and the Synod, established the Sunday school movement in the Coptic Orthodox Church, and we'll talk some more about that as well. Anything else? Anything? Okay. Well, probably when I started my research to know more about this great modern and inspirational saint in the life of our church, I didn't know much more than what you've told me this afternoon. That basically he was the one who established the Sunday school movement, and he was also the dean of the seminary from 1918 until his death in 1951. But I didn't know much else. But some people ask me usually, what made you interested to go deep and to delve deep into the life and the works and the legacy of this man? So I think it's important to know a little bit of that background. When I did a small research paper in my master's program, I did a paper titled Christian Education in the Church of Alexandria in the First 5 Centuries. So when I came to do the PhD and met with my mentor to discuss a topic, he said to me, "What do you want to research?" So I said to him, "I think I would like to complete or continue that research to do a 2,000-year history of Christian education in the Church of Alexandria." So he said to me, "This is a very broad topic. This is something you can continue to research for the rest of your career. You need to narrow down your thinking towards a particular period or epoch of time or a particular figure." So I said, "Go away and think some more about this." So when I did, I said, well, in our modern history, there was this patriarch who's very well known called Pope Carolus IV. Have you heard of him? Pope Carolus IV, Pope Cyril IV. He's known as the father of reform, or Abul Islah. You know why he was given this title? When did he live? When was he patriarch? See, it's very important that we learn our history, and particularly for me, this modern era of the last 200 years is very significant in the life of the church, and obviously throughout all of our history, but I concentrate more, I have a greater interest in the modern Coptic period of the past 200 years, and I teach this course at the seminary last semester and will be repeated in the future. You see, Pope Carolus IV lived in an era which was very difficult in the life of the church, and it was also a period of darkness where there was very little education. There were no Coptic schools, for example. The ruler at that time was just before Pope Carolus IV. His name was Muhammad Ali Pasha. And he was an Albanian. He was appointed to rule Egypt by the Turks in 1805. And he came into Egypt and wanted to have a very strong army to be able to control the whole region. And so he began to send young people to Europe to study, bring them back to open up powerful military schools, schools for medicine, for engineering, many different aspects that he needed to be able to have a good control and grasp over the country. But unfortunately, he disdained the education of the Copts to some extent. He didn't send any Copts overseas to study. And so when Pope Carolus IV saw this, he then decided to open up Coptic schools for boys and open up Coptic schools for girls for the first time in the history of the Coptic Church. Not only did he do this, he also learned from the very advanced educational methods that Western missionaries had begun to bring into Egypt. Here from America, Protestant missionaries, Catholics from Europe went into Egypt. At first, the target was to convert Muslims to Christianity, and they failed dismally. They couldn't get through the Islamic community. So they had already spent a lot of money coming into Egypt. They weren't just going to leave like this. They started looking around, and then they found this church called the Coptic Church, which was unfortunately in a fallen state. It was in a period of severe darkness. There was no pope or bishop or priest or deacon or layperson that was educated in religion and theology. And so they began to target the Copts. They started opening very advanced schools, and they converted some Copts to Protestantism and Catholicism, but they still were not that successful. So when Pope Carolus saw this, he decided to open up these schools for boys and for girls. That was one important thing that he did. The second important thing he did was bring into Egypt the second printing press. The first printing press was brought into Egypt by the Egyptian government from Europe, and Pope Carolus IV brought in the second printing press into Egypt. He was not in Cairo at the time, and when the press arrived at Cairo train station, he asked his clergy and deacons to have a procession for the printing press from Cairo train station to the Patriarchate. And as I said, he wasn't in Cairo, but he said at the time that if he was there, he would have danced in front of the printing press as David the prophet danced in front of the Ark of the Covenant. A very strange thing, perhaps, that a patriarch would say. Why do you think Pope Carolus IV, the father of reform, said this? Anyone? I know Mina knows. Anyone? Why would a patriarch say this? Yes.
Because then, like, all the church manuscripts would be written on the press, so everyone can know, like, Christianity. Everyone can be educated.
Yeah. So this was the main thing, that if you have a press, what can you do with a press? You publish. You publish books on history, on dogma, on theology, on the liturgy, and so on. Newspapers could be published, religious magazines, and so on. So his vision was that this press then, once it begins publishing, Copts would begin to read again, would begin to be enlightened, would begin to strengthen their faith, and so that when these missionaries come to proselytize them, then they would not be affected and would be able to respond to their incorrect teachings. However, Pope Carolus IV did not remain on the throne of St. Mark for very long. Anyone know dates? Mina, do you remember any dates? Anyone? He was patriarch from 1851 until 1854 until 1861, just over 6 years. And it's believed that the government authorities poisoned him because they were threatened by him that he was going to educate the Copts. And at the time, the authorities preferred to rule over ignorant people rather than people that were enlightened. And so they poisoned him. So the history tells us. Even before this time, the Copts came out. Why did we enter into this period of darkness and ignorance? It was because of 5 centuries prior of severe persecution that our forefathers and mothers went through under the Mamluk dynasty and afterward the Ottoman dynasty, 2 Islamic dynasties, who severely punished the Copts for being Christian. From the time of when the Arabs came into Egypt, they placed a poll tax or a jizya tax on the Copts that if you don't pay this tax, then you must convert to Islam. But under the Mamluk and the Ottoman dynasties, 5 centuries, monks were branded with hot irons on their hand with the name of their monastery and the date of their branding, for example. Coptic was no longer allowed to be used as a language in our services or in public, and those that spoke Coptic had their tongues cut out. When you entered into a Coptic church, you come into our beautiful churches here, for example, and you find beautiful buildings, beautiful icons, great Coptic iconographers that come and write icons in many of our churches. That was not the case during the Mamluks and the Ottoman. What would you find? You would find black walls. They ordered the Copts to paint all of their churches black inside. Imagine what that would do to the sight and the emotions of the people. They were also ordered to wear black only, not the clergy only, everyone. Male, female, everyone, children, everywhere you go, you wear black. More than this, Copts had to wear a 2-pound cross around their neck of 1, 2, or 3 spans of length. And this left a blue mark on the back of their necks because of the heaviness of the cross. And that's where this term Adma Zar'a, or blue bone, came from, to distinguish the Copts from the rest of the community. People at that time were riding horses, except for the Christians, because they were told you can only ride mules or donkeys, and men can only ride side saddle to humiliate them. Imagine all of this suffering that our forefathers and foremothers went through in order to preserve the faith for us throughout these centuries. So don't think for one instant that this faith that we grow up into came to us easily. But people shed their blood. Our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents suffered for our sake to hand down this faith purely to us. And each one of us here today has such a significant and important role to hand this faith down faithfully to our next generation. So you have a role here in this university. There is thousands out there in the university today that know nothing about Jesus Christ. What is your role as Orthodox Christians? By the way you live, by the way you act, by the way you speak, that you become a light to the world and a salt to the earth, to every single person there. That they see you, the way you speak, the way you act, and they see there's something different about you. And certainly that was the case in the life of Saint Habib Girgis that we'll speak about. Any questions so far? Yes.
What Egypt used to be a Christian Coptic country.
Yes.
How did the, in your opinion, how did the Muslims get such a strong foothold in the country?
It was gradual. They came in 641 AD. Some people think that they came in peacefully and so on, but when you read the history carefully, you'll see that that was not the case. In particular, if you read a book by Magid Mikhail or Deacon Severus in Los Angeles, he actually explains all of this in great detail and the actual truth of what happened with documents. And he'll explain how all of this took place and how after a while the Arabic by the beginning of the 8th century had become the official language. Coptic was still there for a few more centuries. But then the church was smart enough and clever enough not to lose its people, to begin writing and translating the theology of the Coptic church in the Arabic language so that people can continue to follow the faith very carefully. but it took a little while for this to take place. Any other questions? Okay, so this is just a little bit of. Okay, so I was talking about Pope Cyril, and then my mentor said, okay, go find what he wrote. I found 2 letters that he wrote to the Metropolitan in Ethiopia. He said to me, you can't do a PhD on this, keep thinking. And then I remember Pope Shenouda III of blessed memory. I was part of his secretariat for 5 years at St. Bishoy Monastery. He would bring up this name, Habib Girgis, and speak about him with visitors and so on. So I said, let me go and have a look what he wrote. And I was very surprised that I found he wrote about 30 books. He was also a poet. He wrote 4 booklets of hymns that he taught the Orthodox faith to the children through the hymns that he wrote. And also he published a journal, religious journal called El Karma, or the Vine, where many articles of history, of patristics, theology that were published by many different authors over 17 volumes. So when I took that information to my mentor, he said, you have more than enough research for one PhD, go ahead and begin. So this, sorry for the long introduction, but this is how it all began. But as I mentioned, that it was a period of darkness. There was a lack of education, religious education in Egypt at the time. There were no educated clergy. There were many problems going on with clergy at that time. And so some people disdained them because of what was going on, because of this ignorance and apathy and lack of education stemming from these 5 centuries of persecution. All of this had a great effect on the atmosphere or the milieu in Egypt around the birth of Saint Archdeacon Habib Girgis. In all of Egypt, can you imagine that there was only one eloquent preacher at this time in the second half of the 19th century? One priest. His name was Father Philithaus Ibrahim Baghdadi. He was an eloquent preacher. He would go from church to church throughout Cairo, Alexandria, all the way down to the south in Aswan, preaching and teaching. And sometimes spiritual revivals that went on for several weeks. Sometimes his sermons went on for 3 hours, and people were not bored. They were hungry and thirsty to hear the word of God, to hear someone preach to them, and they couldn't find. So whenever Father Philithaus turned up to their church, you would find the church is completely full, people standing around the windows of the church because there was no room in the church, with the windows all open, listening to him preach. And he, at the end of his life, Habib Girgis became very close to him and learned much from him in his ministry. But that was the situation. There were 3 matters that were tearing away at the very thread of Coptic identity at that time. One was an internal struggle within the church between the hierarchy, the patriarch and the bishops, and what was known as the Lay Community Council, or the Majlis al-Melli, which was a group of lay people who were highly educated, Coptic elite, and they were responsible for looking after the finances, administration, and the administration of the schools. And so a clash happened between them and between Pope Cyril V. Pope Cyril V is the longest reigning patriarch in our history, just over 53 years on the throne of St. Mark, from 1874 till 1927. 53 years as patriarch. He was a very saintly man, but when this clash happened and no resolution, the Majlis al-Melli, or the Lay Community Council, banished the Pope. They forced him to Baramos Monastery in Skitas and Wadi Natrun for a period of 6 months. So imagine that extra pressure now on the church without the head of the church present, the more difficulties that arose from this. But then he was returned later with a great fanfare and celebration when this issue was resolved. But there was always this tension, not only at the time of Pope Carolus V, but throughout the life of the Majlis al-Milli, this tension between the Synod, the Patriarch, and the Majlis al-Milli. The second thing that was tearing at the very thread of Coptic identity was pressures on the church coming from government authorities, not giving the church full freedom to carry out all of its ministry easily. And thirdly, pressure coming from the Western missionaries coming into Egypt, trying to convert Copts to Protestantism and Islam. So this is the atmosphere that Habib Girgis was born into, a sad and difficult period in the life of the church. And this is what Pope Shenouda III of blessed memory says about Habib Girgis. He says this: our teacher, Archdeacon Habib Girgis, pioneer of religious education in our generation, started his life in an age that was almost devoid of religious education and knowledge. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, as the book of Genesis describes. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and the light was Habib Girgis. So here Pope Shenouda is describing Habib Girgis as a light that comes into the world, and this light that he brought was the light of religious and theological education that was very much lacking in the life of the church at this time. Any questions? Yes.
Between the layman council and the patriarch, who had like the moral authority to to decide like what's right and what's wrong?
Obviously, the patriarch, he's the head of the church. He's responsible for all of the ecclesiastical needs of the church. But what happened at the time was that the government, and at that time, British occupation had taken place in Egypt. So the Brits were in control, as well as the Western missionaries, some of them coming from Britain, right? They started in a sneaky way to encourage the Majlis al-Milli, the lay community council, to turn on their patriarch. So it was very, very nasty stuff that was going on, and some dirty politics, unfortunately. Any other questions? Habib Girgis was born in 1876. I don't have an exact date, but he lived for about 75 years. And he fell asleep when? Does anyone know? It's a very easy date to remember. Anyone? It's very easy to remember his feast day. Do you know what is the feast day of St. Mary? When do we celebrate the feast of St. Mary? Huh? I can't hear. Huh? Anyone? August 27th? 22nd, yes. The feast day of Habib Girgis is one day before. So he fell asleep on 21 August 21, 1951. So he lived for about 75 years. So always his feast day is one day before the feast day of St. Mary. So easy for you to remember. His father's name was Girgis Mankarios. He died in 1882 when Habib Girgis was only 6 years old. So imagine a young child losing his father at this age. With all these other problems that are going on, must have been very difficult for him. But his mother, Miriam, who died in 1939, was a very faithful Christian, a very devout woman. She was sick most of her life, bedridden, but she cared for the education of Habib Girgis and took him to study at the great Coptic school that was connected to the old patriarchate in Asbakeya in Cairo. And he excelled in his studies there until he completed his high school. He had three other siblings, Ghali, who died as a youth, Kamel, and Miriam. Those were the siblings of Habib Girgis. By the end of the time they had finished his high school in 1893, Pope Carolus V, or Pope Cyril V, the longest reigning patriarch in our history, saw the dismal state of his priests, and he decided to open a seminary for them. And this took place in November of 1893. November 1893. But for the first 4 years, so Habib Girgis finished his high school and he was accepted to go into this, to study at the seminary, along with a group of other students. They came in. For the first 4 years, no teacher to teach religion or theology. So why a seminary? What were they teaching them? They were teaching them geography of the Bible. They were teaching them science, mathematics, history, all these other subjects, except the most important thing was why they joined the seminary, to study theology and doctrine and Orthodox faith. But they couldn't find anyone to teach them. And then someone came up with a great idea. Why don't we bring in Father Philithaus Ibrahim Baghdadi to teach the students? He's an eloquent preacher and teacher, has great knowledge. Why shouldn't he come? So they brought him in. He gave a few lessons, and then one day, very shortly after he was appointed, during a lesson, he collapsed in the class. They carried him home. A few days later, he died because he was very ill and very senior by that time. So while Habib Girgis was in his final year as a student, they appointed him to teach the first year students at the seminary. Why? Because he was not the type of person that gave up easily. But in fact, he was very resilient and very tenacious by nature. So he writes in one of his books saying that he went into the library of the Patriarchate, which was a very rich library of resources and books and manuscripts, and began to read and research himself and take notes of everything. And he said that he did not leave one page unturned until he had read everything in the library and taken notes, and really throughout all these 4 years, he didn't just give up, but he began to educate himself, and that's why they decided to appoint him to teach while he was still a student. And a few months later, after he graduated, he was appointed to teach full-time at the seminary. Then we see in 1897, he gives a very important lecture over 2 Sundays, part 1 and part 2, at the great Coptic school where he was a student previously. And he titled this lecture, this was the first lecture he gave ever, Christian Religion, Adiyan al-Masihiyya. And in the first half of the lecture, he begins telling his audience, let's go back to the early centuries, the first 5 centuries of the Coptic Church of Alexandria, and see what was happening then. He speaks to them about St. Mark coming into Alexandria, preaching Christianity there. He tells them about the great era of martyrdom under, in particular, Emperor Diocletian, and the thousands of Christians that he massacred in Egypt, and the many child martyrs, mothers, men, children that were martyred under the army of Diocletian, the emperor, Roman emperor. He speaks to them about the great monastic fathers, about St. Anthony and St. Macarius and St. Pachomius. Speaks to them about the great doctors and pillars of the church, such as Athanasius and Cyril and Clement of Alexandria and many, many others. And he spends the whole lecture telling them about the glories of the early Coptic church. Then in the next Sunday, he says to them, come and now let's look at our dismal state, what we have reached now. And tells them some of the issues that the church is going through and how now there is lack of education and ignorance and apathy in the church as a whole. Come now, let us work together. Let's put our hands together to return back the glories of the early church of Alexandria. And the people were very inspired by his powerful speech. He was a very eloquent preacher. He had a sonorous voice, a very powerful voice, and a very attractive voice that when he spoke, people listened. It was like a magnet. We don't have any audio recordings as far as I know, but I can imagine listening to one of the sermons of Habib Girgis, how powerful it must have been. In attendance at these lectures was the editor-in-chief of a Coptic newspaper at the time called Misr, or Egypt. His name was Tadros Bek Shinoud al-Maktabadi. And he was so impressed by this young, eloquent preacher and by what he had to say, he took the permission of Habib Girgis and he published many of copies of his lecture and distributed it to thousands of people, Copts, that they may read this, begin to awake, and realize we can't remain in this dismal state and we need to do something to improve the plight of the Copts in Egypt and their education. Any questions? I see some people are texting, so I don't know if you are so inspired by what Habib Girgis did that you are texting to your friends. Yes.
We're fortunate to know about a lot of the early Coptic fathers today and read their books. Was that information available to most of the people back then? Were they reading it in the churches?
As I said, there was 5 years of persecution.
Right.
During this time, people were just trying to survive on a daily basis. So there was this golden era of Christian Arabic writing from the 10th to the 13th century, about 3 centuries of some enlightened scholars at the time, like Buddhist Bushi, Ibn Kambar and others that are very well known during that period. They were writing theology in Arabic, and so people were reading that material. But after that, probably it started to deteriorate again after this golden era of 10th to the 13th century. Other questions? Okay. After this first lecture that he gave a second lecture at the church of Harat Sa'ayin, which was a suburb in Cairo. And as he was about to begin to preach at the church, he finds Pope Carolus V entering into the church. And he comes to stand on his throne. And as Habib Girgis begins to preach, the Pope begins to bless him with his cross, begins blessing the congregation. And the Pope, feeling great joy and great inspiration that something amazing is about to happen in the life of the church through this young, eloquent preacher. And then he brings him in and learns more about what he has been doing, what he has been studying. He ordains him as an archdeacon, appoints him as his personal disciple, and even had organized to have a meeting with Habib Girgis every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. to seek his wisdom on many affairs of the church, and also would invite him to attend the Holy Synod meetings, even though that this is only for the patriarch and the bishops. But Habib Girgis had a special place, and the Synod respected him, and so he was invited to give advice even at the Synod meeting. So this was the second lecture he gave at the Church of Harid Sa'id. Are you finding this interesting, or what do you think? Yes.
One question, why didn't people ordain him as a priest or a bishop?
Thank God that he did. Why? He was nominated several times to be bishop and once to be patriarch, but was rejected by the Synod because he was not a monk. He was celibate, he was an archdeacon, which is a priestly rank, but he was never ordained priest or bishop. In my opinion, if he had become pope or bishop or even a parish priest who had been so busy with his ministry and administrating to his diocese that he would not have had time to do all of the amazing work that he did for religious and theological education in the church. Other questions? Okay. Well, you still have some more energy, or you are tired?
Say this.
Yeah.
To carry on the question, at the time, what was his reason for refusing? Or was he refused, as the great said, or he had reasons also?
No, he was refused because he was not a monk. Because always we ordain bishops from the monastic rank. So he was not, even though he was celibate, but he was not a monastic. He wasn't living in the desert, in the monastery. And so the idea was rejected by the Synod. Yes.
So the Senate respected him enough to take his words in like important meetings and important.
Yeah, because he was very well educated compared to them, right?
Exactly. So they respected him to that extent. Why didn't the same way like they bent the rules to invite him into the
No,
Senate?
because the rules are the rules. Right? They ordained only from the monastics, right? Even though before in history, lay people were, even elected patriarch. But now this was set for many centuries that this is how the church runs. So they start with that. All right. Then we see that the Synod and the Pope realize that there is lack of education for children, religious education. So a few decrees come out. In 1898, the Synod wrote out a decree, the Pope the following year, and then another one in 1903, speaking about the importance of education of the young and the importance of coming to church on Sunday and partaking of communion and so on. And so Habib Girgis started to think to himself, who's going to take on this task? It's good to put out a decree, but nothing will happen. Who's going to do all of this education? So he comes up with an idea, a very simple idea, a catechism, simple catechism, question and answer, Q&A. Who is Jesus Christ? He's the second person of the Trinity. Who is Saint Mary? She is the Theotokos, the Mother of God. What are the 7 sacraments of the church? And he lists the 7 sacraments of the church. Then he gathered a group of children at the Virgin Mary Church in a suburb called Fagala in Cairo, where he gathered the children together. He gave out this catechism, or he just did it by memorization and rote learning, asking the question and then giving them the answer, and the students repeat after him. Simple teaching memorization method. Later you will see how this very simple catechism then develops into a much more advanced curriculum once he does more research, once he delves into what is happening in Europe in education and educational methods, and incorporates them into the curriculum that he was developing for the Sunday school children in Egypt. But that's how it began. Not only this, but he cared for the education of the Sunday school teachers themselves. He put out 6 volumes for the teachers, for every age group, saying to them, this is the psychology you need to understand of the children at this age group. These are the suitable lessons that you can use for them. These are the activities that you can carry out with the children at this age group, so that the teachers are then more careful and more understanding of how to better train themselves and educate the children under their care. 6 volumes that he put out for the teachers. But he also gave great attention to female education, to education of the girl. And these are the exact words of Habib Girgis himself. This is what he says about the education of girls. He says, as for the ministry to girls after the age of 10, so they were mixed up to 10 years old, boys and girls were in the same class for religious education. But after the age of 10, they are to be cared for by women who would conduct their meetings at different times than the meetings for boys. The male Sunday school teachers and the members of the Coptic Youth League. The Coptic Youth League was our modern youth ministry under the care of Bishop Musa. But back then it was called the Coptic Youth League and was only ministry to boys, this Coptic Youth League. The male Sunday school teachers and the members of the Coptic Youth League are not to interfere in or oversee the ministry to girls. Women are to set suitable activities separate from those of the Coptic Youth League and the higher committee was the Sunday school central committee responsible for all the administration of Sunday school. And the higher committee is to set up a special organization to supervise and direct the ministry of young females. So you can see cares for education of the young, cares for the education of women. And then, because illiteracy was so high in Egypt, he began to devise ways how to overcome this. If the children cannot read and write, how do you educate them about their faith? He used 3 methods. One was the liturgy itself. When you come into the liturgy in a church, it's a sensory experience. It engages all of your senses, as you are fully aware. But besides the liturgy, he did 2 other things. One was importing from Europe religious pictures of the Bible, Old and New Testament stories, beautiful colored pictures. I have some of them. And then he printed booklets quarterly booklets for every 3 months. And the scriptural lesson of the day, of the Sunday, would be distributed to the students. The teacher then would describe the lesson. And as we say that a picture tells 1,000 words, the kids could pick up this picture anytime and could remember what this lesson was about. For those that could read and write, there was a summary on the back that he printed with a verse for them to learn. This is what we call a popular type of education, using art in this way, as we have also in our churches with our iconography. The other thing he did was the hymns that he wrote, the poems that he wrote, and he adapted them to Coptic music from Tasbaha, from liturgy, from Piyaht, from Lent, from all the different seasons of the year, so that they would not be influenced by the Western music that had started to come into Egypt by that time by the missionaries. So popular education. Another amazing thing he did was caring for people in remote villages throughout Egypt. I found a book by mere chance, booklet, titled Iftiqad al-Qarya, Ministry or Visitation to the Villages. What he did, he would bring university Sunday school teachers that was still studying in university during their 3-month summer break. And he would gather them and tell them, this is the plan, this is what we're going to do. He would send them 2 by 2 into a particular route. He would say to them, first thing to do, go to the government census office, pick up the latest census to know where the Copts are in the villages. 2, go into the central office of Sunday school And I found this in one of the footnotes at the bottom of a page. Go and pick up the booklets about the life of Christ written in the Lobach method. I didn't know what is Lobach. It's written in Arabic. So I tried to write it in English, and I Googled the name, and I got lucky. First thing that popped up at the top, Frank Charles Lobach, this name. He was an American. He was a Protestant missionary. He was sent to the Philippines to what were known as the Moro tribes. These were tribes that were illiterate. They couldn't read and write. And he devised the method called each one teach one. Those that know how to read and write to teach those that couldn't. And he published this. And he was hitting two birds with one stone. He was teaching them how to read and write, and at the same time, teaching them about the life of Christ who was preaching to them. So obviously these books had come to Egypt. They were probably written in English. Came to Egypt, or Habib Girgis imported them, I'm not sure, were translated into Arabic, and were used as a method to remove illiteracy and to teach people their faith. And you tell them, take this and go down into the village. When you go into the village, you split. Each one of you to visit 10 families. You tell them a scriptural story. You hang an image of Christ on the wall of one of the rooms, the very simple rooms or huts. People did not even know they were Christian. Some of them were not even baptizing their children. We're not going to church because there were no churches in the villages. And Habib Girgis would plead with the priests from the cities, come into these villages, bring with you the altar board, pray liturgies for these people, take their confession, find what their problems are, right? And then you say to them, find 2 or 3 people that can read and write to teach the rest of the village. It was a grand idea, great vision. But I think the main problem he would have met was actually finding 2 or 3 people in the village that could read and write, that could teach the rest of the villages. But at least it gives you how he was always thinking outside of the box. He never put up with the status quo. He always tried to do better. He always tried to reach every single Copt to educate them. He even planned the curriculum for tradespeople, blue-collar workers, that to educate them in their faith. He even put out a 4-page Bible study every Sunday for families. Encourage your families to come to church, partake of communion, take home the Bible study, sit with their children, read the passage, answer the questions together, come back for a new Bible study the following week, trying to reach to every single person that he could. Any questions?
I'm just making sure I understand what you're saying. Is it fair to say there was no public school in that period of time where they learned the basic reading and writing?
There was, but not always very effective. So before this time, there was what was known as the Kutab system. Kutab system were basically blind cantors that would bring a group of children in the foyer of a church or somewhere, and they would teach them to learn by rote learning or memorization some of the Psalms, some of the Gospels, some parts of the Scripture, basic arithmetic and writing. Yeah, and then public schools started after this. Yeah, so during Habib Girgis' time, there were public schools. Yeah, and there were Coptic schools as well. Any other questions? I think we only have a few minutes left, so I'll try to wrap this up. A Central Sunday School Committee was established in 1918, and this became the official date where we recognize the official start of Sunday schools in the Coptic Orthodox Church. He also had several conferences for religious educators. in Egypt in the 1940s. He began this. He was a, a great administrator. He put out all of these administrative forms to collect information about every branch of Sunday school, and he would collect this information into an annual report with a budget, how much was spent on Sunday schools, what were the publications, how many new branches. By the end of his life, there was 43,000 Sunday school students and several thousand teachers, and had spread all throughout Egypt and even into Sudan and into Ethiopia. He speaks, if you're interested, there is this book. It's available in English and Arabic. You can find it on Amazon, on Habib Girgis. So it is a reworking of my dissertation. But he speaks about how the curricula, then he continued to develop it. Instead of one general curricula for all of the age groups, he begins to divide it up for suitable lessons for every different age group. He also speaks about taking a holistic view of child development, and he takes this theory from a German scholar called Friedrich Froebel, who was the one who established the kindergarten movement throughout the world. And so he says some very fascinating things here, rather than this rote learning method, that the teacher there is basically as a guide to give the students the opportunity to learn everything on their own. So it's very interesting to see how his thought continued to develop throughout his career. He also speaks about how Sunday school began to change the lives of the family, how the children coming back home from Sunday school, implementing what they had learned. And one 12-year-old child for the first time comes home, tells his family to gather, and then they read a chapter of the Bible together, and they pray Our Father, and then he directs his words to the Father and says, "Oh Father, you are supposed to be the priest of the family. If you are incapable of taking on this role, do not disallow your son for remaining in the bosom of the Heavenly Father." Very powerful words that he speaks about. But to finish with, he also went through so many obstacles in his life, many resistances. Priests at the beginning were not allowing him to preach in their churches because they were fearful of him, that he was educated and going to take over their churches and their role. But he gave them the opportunity to lead the Sunday school branches in every parish, and then when they felt that they were in control and could see the benefit, they increased for more and more of this to take place. But many things that were hardships he went through, and I'll just end with this quote. After someone attacks him viciously and tries to say that he's a thief and taking the donations and misusing them, lots of harsh words. But this is Habib Girgis' response. Very inspirational words. "Despite efforts that sapped my health and crushed my strength, I did not surrender for one day to anyone who resisted or envied me. This is a great grace that I do not deserve, as one cannot be envious or resistant except the one who does not have grace. Stones are thrown only at the trees that are filled with fruits, and birds peck only at ripe fruits. I thank God Almighty that through His grace, despair never penetrated my soul for even one day. But in fact, I constantly smile at the resistance. I have forgiven and will continue to forgive from the depth of my heart everyone who desires to be my enemy in vain, knowing that it is inevitable that obstacles will come along the path of those who desire to serve God and people. It is inevitable that there is no honey without the bee's sting, and he who abandons positive work for the sake of the murmurings of people resembles a horse that bolts when it sees its own shadow. Gold does not lose its value if it is rejected by animals, and the sun is not blemished if you cannot see it one day. It is imperative that we do not fail in doing good, for we shall reap the harvest in due time, if we do not weary. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Very inspirational. He went through hardships, but I think we can learn a lot from him. As young people, we can learn resilience, we can learn tenacity, we can learn how to be strong at times of darkness and when we feel weak. When we look at someone like this and all that he went through, that it inspires us to continue along the path and not to give up. Also, to see his love for the church and the hierarchy of the church is quite amazing. His love for the children that he served so diligent, and also the great passion that he had for his work. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and have a great thought, and he would write it on the wall near his bed so he would not forget it. Pope Shenouda would say that every time he went to meet with Habib Girgis, he would make sure that he had a pen and a notepad so that every word he uttered or all of the wisdom he would say, he would write it down so that he would not forget it later. His deep love for reading and study, and that's so important for us as young people as well. The great administration system that he had for education. He was also an amazing innovator, always thinking outside of the box. He was a righteous man, and he was just, and he was someone who did not bear grudges, and there are many examples of that, but I don't have time to bring them up now. He was also an eloquent preacher with a powerful, sonorous voice, and a reformer. He wrote a book in 1942 titled something like How the Church Can Reform Itself in a Period of 10 Years, and he spoke about around 10 different departments that needed to be established and how this reform would take place. Maybe sometimes, he was dreaming a little bit too much and maybe having a lot of idealistic views, but it just shows you his love and his passion for the church and for its people and how he wanted to lift up the level of the Church of Alexandria and its people. I apologize about the comment I made earlier about someone texting. It's just sometimes it's distracting while I'm talking, so I hope no one took any offense on that. Any final questions? Well, thank you very much for your attention. God bless you all.
Thank you, Grace, and was very interesting. It was just a brief summary of how we learn from a great saint, that a modern day saint. And as actually yesterday during JAD, which we had an event yesterday, Sayyidina, with Jesus Awareness Day, I was talking with Abuna Gabriel, like, look how many of us standing around the table and how much we could do on this campus. As Sayyidina said, it's our role to spread the good news and to have even 1% of the vision that someone like Saint Archdeacon Habib Girgis would have. So we have a lot to learn and a lot we could follow from such great saints that we learn about. Thank you so much, Sayyidina, for being with us and coming and spending the afternoon with us. Is there any announcements that we have to?
On Monday, God willing, His Grace and Gabriel will be coming for Tasbeha Calibers at 5:30. That's all. And then liturgy is going to be April 24th. And what else? And then we'll just have our last Wednesday meeting next week, April 17th.
Listen.
God the Father, and the grace of His only begotten Son, and the gift and fellowship of the Holy Spirit, be be with you. All go in peace. May the peace of the Lord be.
Also, sister.
We're missing out.
Guys, don't forget to take attendance. Don't forget to take attendance. It's coming up right now. It's coming up.
Guys, make sure you guys do the attendance, please.
Make attendance, guys. I was taking some classes.
They have like some. Yeah, so like this. I think like half. I have an exam.
Later. Is it?